Hello, this is John Spink, your instructor for Industry and National Level Food Fraud Prevention Strategy presentation. This is for the International Visitor Leadership Program funded under the U.S. Department of State. And this is for the French delegation presented at Michigan State University. This is a supplemental video for reference later for attendees or I guess anybody that finds it. First off, we're a university and curriculum and education is a key part of what we do. And the first one we'd like to point out is our massive open online course, and you'll notice the Chinese characters there. This has a Chinese version that has subtitles that were supported and included by the Chinese National Center for Food Safety Risk Assessment. The MOOC is offered twice a year, mid-May and mid-November. We also offer executive education or short courses. These are industry focused or government management focused. These are week-long programs, one on food fraud management and another on a vulnerability workshop. We also have graduate courses. These are all online courses. Our entire food safety program is online and all the classes are online. The courses include food fraud under our anti-counterfeit and product protection program, quantifying food risk, global food safety, which has a module on food fraud, and food protection and defense, which has a packaging module specifically. Then packaging for food safety. All these are 3-credit courses at Michigan State. If you take 4 of the courses, you can earn a certificate, a graduate certificate in food fraud prevention. If you like the program and you want to keep going, then you can roll these credits into a Master's of Science in Food Safety. This is, again, a completely online program. Well, to start our program and presentation, here's something to consider. Kind of joking aside, but when we're dealing with counterfeiters or criminals or fraudsters, why wouldn't they review this video and review our activities? Review the ways that we're trying to catch them or prevent them from conducting their crime. So this is something that we really need to consider, and we might as well use it instead of be worried about it or fight against it, because if we consider this, then we can actually communicate to the criminals and let them know that they might as well not even try because we have coordinated, organized programs. That puts the pressure on us to then organize our programs and prevention. So let's use it. Let's use this to our advantage. And that's what we'll do in this presentation, is present how to focus on prevention and then put countermeasures and systems in place both for companies and for countries. Defining food fraud. This is really important to start. And a lot of times people think they already know the definition or have a definition in mind. It's very important to clarify this. With a lot of these kind of emerging areas, they're new, and there's a lot of times there's different projects focusing on different aspects of it. Food fraud widely is defined as deception using food for economic gain. And a term that people might recognize is economically motivated adulteration. This is a subcategory as defined by FDA in 2009. FDA defined this as a substance used for economic gain, and that's only a substance. The broad definition of food fraud is consistent with others such as the Global Food Safety Initiative, which is industry-wide food safety standards, the European Commission, the United Kingdom, international standards organizations, and others. The motivation is economic gain. And the key, this is different than food defense or some other activities because the motivation for food defense is traditionally harm or terror. So these are two different things. And the motivation, the key is that the motivation is different. Now when we look at something such as intentional adulteration, a general term, that just reading the words and looking in the dictionary is any substance purposely added for any reason, intentional adulteration. But then there's the Food Safety Modernization Act intentional adulteration rule that really focuses only on terrorist or large-scale attacks with the intent to harm. Right there is a really explicit example of how terminology and definitions are important. The effect. There's always an economic threat for food fraud, that there's a harm. There's not always a public health threat, but there is a vulnerability. When product is mishandled, it's outside control, then there's a chance that that product could become a public health threat. So there's a vulnerability. Some products, such as melamine in infant formula and pet food, becomes a threat. There's a lot of examples here. We won't go into detail. If you need one slide to explain food fraud and the overview, this is the slide to use. So we give copyright permission for this and everything. Use it, but just cite us appropriately. So when we're looking at food fraud, we need to understand the motivation, because we're trying to persuade humans, bad guys, criminals, to not act. So this is different than our traditional concepts of food safety and food defense. We know these as the traditional issues that occur, or with food defense, the intentional attacks. And food fraud and food quality really round out the matrix here. And we put in food fraud because, again, the motivations are different, and food quality. This is a separate concept because we did not try to create a food quality incident. Also, it's important to put this under that concept, because usually in a company, food safety, food fraud, and food defense is managed under food quality. It's usually the responsibility of the food quality group. On one side, we've got an unintentional actions. On this side, intentional. The fraudster or the criminal, the food defense attacker, knows what they put in there. And for food defense, there's a harm: public health, economic, or terror. FDA specifically focuses in the intentional adulteration rule on the public health hazards only, and wide-scale public health hazards. The motivation for food fraud is economic gain. And a key by separating out this motivation is that this helps us to understand more clearly how to implement prevention. Because we look at exactly, not the motive that's economic gain, but the motivation, why they thought that this was a good idea. Overall, if we improve these, we improve food security, which is the supply, the ongoing supply of safe, nutritious food. Now, with food fraud, we need to look at this in the continuum of all food risks. So the first thing that people are concerned with is that it sounds like there's a lot more activity going on, and this will be very costly. But really, when we look at this, probably 99% of all audits, testing, oversight, inspections, traceability, transparency, and data collection are already implemented within your enterprise. Food quality. So there's a lot of activities going on, obviously, in the food quality area: monitoring, measuring, assessing. And then food safety as well. It's very similar but different. So food safety will look more specifically at things like microbes, E. coli, very specific activities. But in that area that is specific, they are very specific. And then food defense. And we put this way out here because a lot of times food defense is focused a lot more on physical security, such as controlling access to a plant, or monitoring or controlling the product while it's being distributed to a retailer. Well, food fraud fits in here. And the key that we show is really all these other activities. They increase transparency of the supply chain. And when the supply chain is transparent, that we see product moving through, it reduces the opportunity for the criminal. So really with food fraud, there's probably a very little extra that we need to do that we're not already doing. And we call this the food protection continuum. Now, a key concept is the Global Food Safety Initiative and industry actions. And I'll admit that when I first started working with GFSI, I did not really understand the process. So I asked them to put this together. And this is how we see food fraud implementation for GFSI. Originally in the bottom left, you'll see regulations listed in yellow. And this is where everything started, because there were a lot of different types of regulations. Different countries had different laws, and companies had to comply with every law. So it could be every country in Europe had a different law. So a group called the Consumer Goods Forum, which is a group of CEOs and companies for all consumer products, not just food. But the food companies saw that there's really a way to coordinate more. So they created GFSI, the Global Food Safety Initiative. And they have this issue 7, version 7, that has just come out. It says here 2016, but it's now released. But what GFSI does is GFSI defines the idea. They define what should be covered in a food safety management system. They do not write standards, and they do not implement, and they do not certify standards. They just provide the overall idea. And then there's a group of companies, scheme owners or standard owners. They create the standard, the document that will be implemented. And so there's a wide range of companies that do that. And they will then submit their standard to GFSI to state that they have GFSI certification or compliance or alignment with GFSI. And then companies do it. They take the standard and they implement it. These are best practices, and it's great because they're common, they're harmonized terms and processes, so there can be a lot of best practices sharing across the industry, and there really is quite a bit. And even across GFSI, there's a lot of programs in place, such as what we do at Michigan State, either through the Global Markets Program for our colleagues in the Food Science Department or with us on food fraud, communicating across the industry. And this really helps the overall industry become safer, which helps everybody. And the next step are certification bodies. And these are the people that confirm that the company did it, complied with the standard, and that standard was aligned with GFSI. A key with this, a critical key for a country, is that if the governments require a process, rather than a specific set of actions or countermeasures, if they just require that companies implement a process, then they really don't need to do more, because a country would know that many companies are implementing things like GFSI. So there are standards out there. The countries, the governments are not just making wild claims or requirements on companies. They know that there's this activity going on. And a key with that, there is great efficiency by just requiring a process, because that further strengthens the regulations, which strengthens the safety of the food supply chain, which is the ultimate goal. So, to look at GFSI in a little different way, there was a food fraud think tank that was created in July 2012 and ran until December 2014. I was a member of the think tank. There were 4 companies involved, 6 eventually, but 4 groups. And one of the main outputs of this group was looking at this food safety management system, and to show how these different concepts fit together under the food safety management system. So one pillar, a separate concept, is food safety, and these are HACCP programs that we know, hazard analysis and critical control point plans. These are very specific and extremely scientific, in the sense that we mean that they're very tightly monitored, and there's very clear tests at each level, such as the presence or not of a microbe. The next is food defense, or TACCP. And the TACCP concept originally came from PAS 96, publicly available standard 96 in the UK, which was a food defense action. So this is TACCP threat assessments. And now there could be different terms that were used, but this is what PAS 96 used, and it worked for the overall management system here. And finally, a separate concept, a separate pillar had to be created for food fraud, because again, the motivation, the prevention actions are fundamentally different than for food defense or for food safety. And so this is a vulnerability assessment. Now, one thing that's important is that the critical control points for each of these different pillars can be very different. Again, in the HACCP side, they're very technical, scientific, and measurable. And on the food fraud side, the vulnerabilities, these are definitely broader, and they're more crime science, situational crime prevention, criminology theories. Compliance for food fraud. First, FSMA, Food Safety Modernization Act Preventive Controls. These are the U.S. laws. And generally, FSMA states that any agent that leads to a hazard that requires a preventive control, including from act that is economically motivated. Meaning that any act that's economically motivated, such as putting in a filler, or cheating on a substance, or species swapping, such as horse meat and beef, or stolen goods, that leads to an agent. That an agent is just something that causes a problem. So if that's melamine, that could be melamine. It could be horse meat that is diseased, or it could be stolen goods that expire and are mishandled and a pathogen grows. But that could lead to a hazard that requires a preventive control. This is the scope of what's covered. A key is how to define a hazard that does or doesn't require a preventive control. So there's a lot of activities that are identified as a vulnerability or a hazard, but they are not a risk. And a hazard is something that has a that could have a chance of harm, but a risk is that multiplied by the opportunity really for it to happen. So the issue is that for any type of vulnerability that's found, any type of agent that could occur, there needs to be an assessment to state why you did or did not consider it a hazard that requires a preventive control. Now, this might sound like going into great detail and too much detail, but you'd rather deal with this before a problem goes to court. And that's why we look at great detail and look to have a holistic overall control of the entire system. The next is the Global Food Safety Initiative, and these are groups like BRC or FSSC 22000. They require for compliance to cover all fraud, that's all types of food fraud, all products, and also to conduct a vulnerability assessment and include a prevention plan. Another different type of compliance is financial regulations, and whether it's Sarbanes-Oxley in the US or other European or Chinese or foreign laws, there is oversight required by governments. And even for private companies, the investors don't just let a company give people $1 billion and let them go. There's oversight and there's auditing. And this would say that a public company is required, but this enterprise risk management is also used for private companies. A key is that there's a requirement which can be a criminal liability for the CEO, the C-suite, the CFO, or the board. They need to manage or disclose all threats to revenue. So food fraud is one of those type of threats, or could be, and that's why you'd need to do a vulnerability assessment. The conclusion is conduct a vulnerability assessment for all fraud and all products, but not all vulnerabilities are a risk that are hazards that require a preventive control. International standards. There's a lot of different activities that are broader than laws or regulations, but they support these laws and regulations. The first is ISO Technical Committee 23, which covers ISO 22000, which is food fraud or food safety management. These are now expanding with the documents open for public discussion starting in May, expanding to include food fraud and food defense. ISO 22000 is the foundation for GFSI, so this is a key starting point. Another ISO standard is Technical Committee 292, Security Management and Resilience. And there's 4 main activities going on there that apply to businesses that happen to be dealing with products that happen to be food. And the first one is Working Group 4 on product fraud. And a key here is definitions of things like the fraud opportunity, product fraud, and other ways to control and manage this product. This is great for us in food because it means that people have already been thinking about this. So we're not starting just with a clean slate. And the second is Working Group 3, which is on business continuity. This focuses on crisis management. A recall or suspicious activity for food fraud would be something that would fall under business continuity standards or crisis management. Then ISO 28000 is supply chain security. This is implemented at many companies, at least parts of it, if not formally or informally. But this is something that's already in place to monitor product throughout the supply chain. Control it, really. ISO 27000 is information security. This plays a part as well because we want to control certain aspects of our activities, such as traceability codes, have them accessible when needed, but not open for hacking or other types of fraud. And then Codex Alimentarius. This is the global food code, the food law, and currently there's a discussion paper on food fraud that's being reviewed in May 2017, and there's an electronic working group possible on this topic. It will be interesting to see what does happen with Codex based on the scope and definitions of the Codex projects. InfoSan is another part related to Codex. It's WHO and FAO under the UN have this activity for information sharing on food safety incidents. And it was one of 4 topics at an annual meeting in November 2016, which is key that it was that important that was one of the 4 topics. And then survey members, a survey is going on to survey members on the role of InfoSan in food fraud prevention. And that will be probably occurring later in May or June 2017. So to look at recommendations for countries or companies, a first concept is a paper that we wrote on the role of the public-private partnership in food fraud prevention, and this includes implementing the strategy. So what we did first is to outline the concepts of the basic foundations and principles, and a second article defined the steps, the first steps to implementing that. So this paper outlines the steps necessary to begin a country or industry-wide vulnerability assessment and the development of a food fraud prevention strategy. A key being that this can apply to an entire country. So just as a basic reference, looking at public-private partnership, what is it and the foundation? We went into great detail in the article on this. So really looking at these public-private partnerships formed when public institutions of government coordinate with private institutions of industry. This can be through a non-governmental organizations or just a group coming together specifically to address a complex problem. These public-private partnerships recognize both parties have certain advantages relative to the other in the performance of specific tasks. And by allowing each other to do what it does best, public services and infrastructure can be provided in the most economically efficient manner. Working together, a coordinated prevention plan is more efficient than working separately. When considering food fraud prevention, the complex problem is most efficiently addressed by domestic and international cooperation between government and industry in a public-private partnership. That's our main recommendation. And there again, for countries to first look at yourself at the high level and then start to look at how the public-private partnership operates. And then these public-private partnerships may be a unique collaboration with non-traditional focus. So this is something we've seen with things like task forces. So we can bring that together, and food fraud and a prevention strategy clearly meets this overall definition. Implementation steps for government agency or industry. So this is a different article that we published. And as you'll notice below that it does have a translation to Mandarin, so because two of our authors were from the Chinese National Center for Food Safety Risk Assessment. The first one we point out is concept one is to formally and specifically mention food fraud as a food issue. Just to make a clear statement. This could be an overall guidance document or a statement, something public, not necessarily in a law or regulation, but a public statement that food fraud is a food issue. And we actually included in there a draft statement, so we tried to make it easy. We had a challenge when people asked us, what does that look like? So something as this statement confirms that the agency expects the food industry to conduct risk or vulnerability assessments, including mitigation or prevention plans where warranted, and so on. So we provided the detail that we thought were important. This, you'll see in the middle there, it does include the types of fraud: adulterant substances, tampering, theft, illegal diversion or gray markets, illegal mislabeling, and intellectual property rights or product counterfeiting, and others. A key is that it requires a vulnerability assessment, but then once that's conducted, there would be a judgment of whether there needed to be a preventive control. Every vulnerability that is a hazard does not become a risk and does not require preventive control. The second concept is to create an enterprise-wide food fraud prevention plan. So this is the country level strategy first, and for companies to have a country level plan as well. And so we didn't stop there. We did try to move forward, and we had our second article that did provide steps. So you'll see on the right, it's a little small font, but we'll go through the details. The first step is very simple: convene a task force. That's not exactly rocket science there. But the key is looking at what is the first step, and that's to bring people together to start taking a look. And the second is to just start thinking about the idea of what a mission or policy statement would look like and start drafting the strategy. And we emphasize just start drafting. So you're kind of beginning with the end in mind, but starting to think about it. And then the real work begins on the third step: conduct a pre-filter food fraud initial screening. This is a pre-filter, a very early, can be a very quick overview, but of the entire country or the entire company. But this is important to just set the foundation. This is not the end of the process. This is just the beginning. And then as you'll see in other steps, there will be more detailed vulnerability assessments as needed. So again, convene a task force, create that enterprise-wide mission or policy as well as a draft concepts for a strategy, conduct that pre-filter, very, very quick, high level, just a starting point. Review additional needs, including additional information for a more detailed food fraud vulnerability assessment. Review those specific food fraud vulnerabilities in an enterprise risk map. And this is something we've got some additional great detail showing how this risk compares to all other risks. That's a major process flaw for many assessments, is that it judges this risk in and of itself, or it compares different risks of the same type. But the real question when we've got a new risk, a new vulnerability that's really never been reviewed, is how this compares to everything else. How does it compare to more funding for police officers to stop mugging? How does it compare to drug interdiction? So we don't know yet, and that's a key step here. Is it provides a frame of reference for how bad food fraud is compared to everything else, and that helps justify resources. Or not. Next, consider countermeasures and control systems to address the very high and high vulnerabilities. Even early in the process, as you start to see some issues that are very high level, then this is a great time to look at it at the start. And then propose a food fraud prevention plan, including the calibration of the food fraud risks on the enterprise risk map. This is where the first step comes together and concludes. And it concludes with a strategy, a recommendation for a food fraud prevention plan. Recommendations. Define food fraud. So that's not real brilliant there, but that's a real key, is what is the scope? And a key is thinking about the food risk matrix. You need to have every type of food risk covered. Every type of food risk needs to be assigned to somebody. Define food fraud as a food issue. And again, this is important for an agency to define who owns this, and for a food agency to state this is the expectation that we address this is a clear statement for the agency itself, but also for the marketplace. What we found is that if an agency has food in its name, that there's an expectation from citizens and consumers that that agency controls food. So it's one thing to say that there may be public health food issues, or it might be different aspects of food, but the bottom line is there's an expectation that if food is in the title, they're managing and protecting against all food. Create a country-level food fraud prevention strategy. Again, this does not have to be big or intense at the start. Just start in on the process and to help calibrate what are the biggest problems and where to focus. Define how to complete it. Boy, you just get started and then you start to, sometimes the minute we finish a real brief one, we constantly get people saying, well, you need to do more. There needs to be more before we move forward. But that's excellent, because we've finished a country-level food fraud prevention strategy, this vulnerability assessment, and there's already people explaining and defining where it needs to be expanded. And this is a real key. Now, if we finished one and no one asked for more, if they were fine with it, then that's great as well, because it's been we showed this final product and there was confirmation that we had done enough. So before just saying goodbye, thank you. There's a lot of ways to engage with Michigan State University. At the top level there are graduate courses. These are 14 weeks beginning May to August. The next level is executive education. These are on campus here, but we also conduct them around the world when there's demand. So we're starting to expand that more into the international arena. We usually have them in spring, summer, and fall. And the next row is multi-client studies. So we definitely work with any group that's interested in expanding into new areas. And the last is our massive open online courses. These are 2 2-hour webinars online. The next one for us is March 3rd and April 6th. It's an audit guide. That's a new MOOC for us. And then the overview MOOC is, as we usually have, mid-May and mid-November. I'd really like to take a moment to thank a lot of people, and I hope that anybody that's listening to this, that you become future colleagues and we work together on projects, and that you consider us as a resource for you as well. So this is a broad topic. It takes a lot of different disciplines and a lot of people working together. So I'm really grateful for all the people that have been just amazing in support of our work. With that, I will say thank you, and if you didn't see it already, you can find this video on YouTube. Search on food fraud and IVLP. Thank you. Have a great day.